Did it, the books, the bid it, the books, the did it, the books, books. All right, welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. Today, I have just finished reading the book Middlemarch by George Eliot, and I realized while I was typing out some notes for this episode that I had mentioned this book multiple times as a book that I was reading. However, sometimes I'll be reading a book, and even very late in the book, we'll just decide, you know what? I'm not going to finish this one. Just not worth the time that I'm about to invest, right? Um, and there was a moment where I almost considered not finishing Middlemarch, and so it would have been somewhat funny if I had mentioned it twice on the show, and then ended up going, well, I just won't finish that one, and that episode just never appeared. Um, might have left you wondering what happened to it if you were paying close attention. So, yes, today, Middlemarch by George Eliot. This is a Norton Critical edition of the novel. If you're not aware, uh, George Eliot is actually a woman. That is really not going to focus. She's actually a woman. Her real name is Marianne Evans. Um, before she wrote this book and several others, she was already fairly well known as sort of a journalist and social commentator in Victorian England. Um, and when she decided to publish fiction, she operated under a pen name, not because she was afraid that as a woman she wouldn't be able to sell books, because there were successful women authors even in that time period. So she wasn't concerned about the possibility that, like, oh, well, nobody's going to buy a book by a woman. Um, she was concerned that book sales might not or might suffer as a result of people being already familiar with her public persona as a social commentator and critic. And so she took the pen name George Eliot to completely disassociate her her already nonfiction canon of writing from her fiction work. Middlemarch is probably the most well known of her books. The other is one that I actually picked up the other day, right before I said that I wouldn't be buying books for the next 6 months, and that would be Silas Marner. That's probably the other one of hers that is most well known. So, um, this book, I think I've said before, is widely considered to be one of the best books in the English language ever. I thought it was fine. I'm not going to bury the lead. I thought it was fine. I did not think that it was one of the best books that I've ever read, but it was fine. There were several things that I thought were really good. There was almost nothing that I thought was really bad, but there was nothing that just shot it over the moon for me. So, Middlemarch, pretty good. Um, it's very readable. I'll say that on its behalf. It's a very readable book. A lot of those classics from the 17 and 1800s, they're really thick, they're dense, they use a lot of, to us, our ears and eyes, odd words, words no longer in common usage, and they just go on and on and on and on. Middlemarch does not do that. Well, not never, but very rarely. There are some odd words. Even, I've been reading extensively for a long time. There are some words that I was like, I'm not sure I know what that is, or I've never seen that before. Um, but in general, very readable, even for somebody who's not, reading this sort of literature all the time. Again, just a plug, Norton Critical Editions, lots of helpful notes. Sometimes she'll use a weird word, and the editor will define it for you at the bottom of the page, which is super great. Love that. Even in addition to all the criticism and backgrounds and commentary in the back of the book, just defining weird words at the bottom of the page is of huge service to the reader. So, um, but yes, it's highly readable, very accessible. It's not about weird kind of arcane 17th, 18th, 19th century stuff. It's about life effectively. the subtitle of the book, which is not obviously on the front and isn't actually included um, in here, I don't think, except in some of the background material. It's called Middlemarch, A Portrait of Provincial Life. And that's kind of the idea of the book. It is not, I will say, and I'll come back to this later, it is not a plot driven piece of work. There is a plot, I discovered. There is a plot, but it's not always immediately clear if what you're reading is contributing to the movement of the plot or if it's just sort of here's a scene of rural life in the early to mid 1800s. Um, and so the to get back to where I was in my train of thought, the real strength of this book is how George Eliot works with characters. There are some really well drawn people in this book. They she does a very 18th or 1800s kind of thing where she tells you a whole lot about a person, right? Modern novels, you get like, hey, here's this person, and I feel like most of the time you're supposed to sort of figure out, all right, who is this person over the course of the novel. In the 19th century, they said, here's this person, and here is just a real short synopsis of their character. Here are their hopes and dreams and their inner thoughts and all this sort of stuff. And she does that. She outlines who these people are in pretty great detail right off the bat for some of them. But the emphasis of the book is on showing you how those people, with their usually very well explained character and persona, how those people interact with these other well-drawn people, and how that causes them to grow or change, or in some cases stagnate, or something else. What is the effect of taking these fairly well-drawn people, putting them into contact with each other, and what does it do to the characters? Huge emphasis in this book on marriage. Eliot uses marriage as one of the primary social relations. I mean, in her time period, it was one of the primary social relations. Pretty much everybody got married. And the result of that, I think, was that there were a lot more kinds of marriages than maybe people are familiar with today. And by that, I mean a lot more kind of stereotypical types of marriages than there are today, right? So she takes, for instance, several of her characters, and they're very interested in getting married. They have a very distinct idea of the type of person or the individual person that they want to marry. And then she puts them within a marriage, right? That character gets married and finds that marriage is nothing like what they expected, right? Their spouse is a totally different person from who they thought they would be. They react to the circumstances of marriage completely differently than they expected because they thought that marriage was one thing and then it turns out to be something else. And so it makes it sound like it's a really sad book. It's not, but it depicts a huge amount of disappointment in love and in marriage. And that's not to say that the book is anti-marriage. I don't think that I don't think she's against the institution of marriage, but she makes it very clear that some of these characters marry someone that they think is right for them and then find that they are just completely incorrect. They found the love match. They found the person who's going to help them self-actualize in a 19th century sense. And then they get married and they get into their honeymoon, or they get into the first couple months of marriage, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? This person's terrible, right? Or this person's boring, or this person doesn't even like me, right? And so that's I think odd for the period, because often what you have is people, one or both persons in the marriage, who actually want things to work and want things to go well and have good intentions, but they're just at cross purposes, and so it doesn't. in a lot of situations. It just doesn't go well. Marriages in this book, most of them, well, a lot of them are just a mess, right? And cause huge amounts of angst and difficulty for people. And then there are ones where you would expect the marriage to just fall apart. There's a character who has some of his secrets revealed, and he has this sort of sordid backstory. And you would expect his wife to just be like, I'm out of here. And several characters even say, hey, you should just leave your husband. And she's like, no, like I'm going to stick with him. And I know he's done all these things, and I've, heard all the rumors, and then he's confirmed some of the rumors for me as being true. And she's like, but, he's always been kind to me and good to me and loved me genuinely, even if he has a bad past. So we'll weather it together. So really, really interesting in that perspective. Um, there are also, I think, some really well, as I said, well drawn people. Really, I guess, real people. Um, there are a couple young men in this book who I think are not sort of traditional literary heroes. There's one character, his name is Fred Vincy, and he is just your typical failure to launch guy. He's pursued secondary education. He almost finishes, and then he's just like, I don't really know what I want to do with my life. And he starts hunting and gambling and getting into debt. He's in love with a girl, but he doesn't want to actually make anything out of his life. He just wants her to marry him. And he's waiting on an inheritance. And so he's just sort of like hanging out, literally living at his parents' house in his mid-20s. And he's just sort of like, yeah, I don't know, I'll figure it out later, I guess. I don't know. I don't really want to be what my dad wants me to be, which is a clergyman. So I'm just going to kind of hang out and like hunt and like gamble and stuff. And that's what he does. And I know people who are kind of like that. But then also, I don't think, because he is one of the focal points of the novel, he's not like a foil for somebody else. He is one of the main characters. But he's not a literary hero. Like he's not a hero. He well, I won't tell you how he turns out, but he is not a hero, right? But that is the characterization we get, is a guy who means really well, really nice, but just complete failure to launch, zero motivation, just really making a hash out of his life. Um, there are, let's see, I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, there's a character, which I think there are a lot of people like this in the world. Um, a character who is highly publicly religious, makes that like the number one thing you know about him is, hey, I'm a super serious 19th century Methodist, which means like really hardcore religious, really into spirituality, really into um, telling people they shouldn't be drinking and gambling and racing horses and going to parties with dancing and playing cards, like all that's of the devil. So like very highly publicly religious person who's actually just not all that pleasant to be around at all, right? Like the light of the gospel and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit has served to make them so otherworldly as to be an alien, and they're just awful, right? Like their personality has just ceased to exist, and they're awful, right? And I say that as someone who is genuinely religious. Um, I know people like that. I know people like that. So Eliot uses a very real person, right? She, I think, probably knew people like that. I mean, she lived at the same time as John Wesley, and so there are lots of Methodists at that time who are nothing like Methodists today, right? Methodists in her time period were these very starkly evangelical, starkly religious people. I mean, I talked about this in my first book review, Wesley and the Anglicans. People who were genuinely interested in the new birth, spiritual new birth, and so complete change in their way of life. And one of the things that often produces is sort of a puritanical streak in people, where they're like, all right, well, I used to do these things before I converted, but those things seem a little sordid to me now, so they must be wrong, and they must be wrong for everybody. So I'm just going to start calling those things out and saying, oh, well, you guys are enjoying racing horses. Well, you're going to go to hell for that. That sort of thing. And there's a character like that in this book. and everybody hates him, right? They're like, oh yeah, he's super religious and kind of an ass. Actually, not even kind of, just he is. Um, and then again, really very real people. The number of obnoxious relatives in this book, off the charts. Just people who are related to you by blood or by marriage or whatever, like distant cousins or the out of town people. And they come in and it's just like, oh, yeah, you're pretty unpleasant, or you really think you're something, don't you? And like, and I'm fortunate to not really have a whole lot of obnoxious relatives, but like I know people who have very obnoxious relatives, and so there's several things that just ring very true. And I think that's what she's attempting to do, is say, hey, here's some very real people who you can imagine populating this town, right? Called Middlemarch. That's the place where everything is happening. It's Middlemarch. Um, so this book does a really good job of showing the depth that people can achieve. There are people in this book who are really good, right? Who do really good things, personally, spiritually, socially. But then there's also just a really good but kind of disheartening depiction of how small-minded and how petty and self-interested and self-absorbed people can be. And part of that, I think she wants to make the case, is that everybody in this book lives in a small town in a rural area, and so their lives are, by consequence, before the telegraph was invented, um, by consequence, their lives are really small, right? Their world is really small. They know about the broader world. I mean, they live in the British Empire, for God's sake, but their world is really small. Their set of concerns are really small, and so they have a very decided provincialism to them. And some of the characters want to get out of there and know that they're in a provincial place and everybody's small-minded. Um, but then a lot of those characters, one in particular, one young woman who's like, oh yeah, the people here are super small-minded and they're the worst. She wants to get out, but she's actually, I would say, probably one of the most small-minded, self-interested people in the whole novel. So there is just this really good interplay of these fairly complex characters, really, really well-drawn, well-outlined characters who behave in very human ways. Um, there's there's not a whole lot. There might be one character in this book who I would say is sort of like the epitome of what a literary character can be, right? Like someone who's actually a stereotype and not really a person, someone who measures up and measures past, standard. Everybody else is so deeply human, so deeply flawed, so very obviously broken in some way. Um, yeah, and even the character that I would say, it's Caleb Garth, if you read the book, even he is depicted as being very absent-minded and bad with money, um, but he's just a good person. He's a very good person. He knows what's important in life. He cares about family. He cares about good work, and he cares about sort of his reputation to a degree. And everything else, he's sort of like, yeah, I don't really care about that. Like whatever. It's not up to me. You know, the smallness of his world doesn't contribute to making him small-minded. It just makes him realize there are very few things that are actually in his control. Whereas a lot of people in the book, they're like, oh, well, my world's kind of small, which must mean I can control it, which is just not true, right? Even in a very small place. So, um, yeah. So, really, really, the characters are the heart of this book. I think, as I'll talk about, I already did, the plot is actually, I think, maybe the weakest part of the book. Yeah, I think so. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'll come back to that. Um, anyway, the book, I kind of talked about this already, but the book centers on the town of Middlemarch, which is a fictional place in the Midlands, which is just north of London. And so all the action except for one part early in the book, everything takes place in Middlemarch. There's one part of the book that takes place in Rome on one of the characters' honeymoons, and then everything else is in Middlemarch itself. Um, and so the book is sort of driven, the plot is sort of driven by these sort of groups of characters who are all connected to each other. There's probably 10 or 12 people who are major characters. I don't know if there's a main character. I guess maybe Dorothea Brooke, who's who the book opens with. She might be the main character. Um, but I'd say about half the book she's not actually mentioned or talked about. So it's hard to make that case. There are sort of clusters of major characters, and there are 4 or 5 in a cluster, and the story will focus on them and what they're doing for 10 chapters, and then they will do something which will influence another cluster of people. And so the next 10 or 12 chapters will be how that cluster of people is getting on in their part of life. And it may reference the previous group, or it's going to reference the next group, or it's going to reference common events which, affect all of them. But when you're introduced to these characters and these clusters of characters at first, often you don't realize they live in the same town. Um, Sometimes because they don't realize they live in the same town, or they live one town over, that sort of thing. So, um, the book almost feels like a pendulum swinging, because you'll be over here with this cluster and it'll swing through them and into another cluster of people, and then through them and into another cluster and on past that, and then it'll come back, right? And you'll have the same cluster of characters but with a whole new set of circumstances, or new information or whatever, and they'll continue to act, but often they're not acting in relation to each other. So like, you've got a cluster of people over here, and their concerns are, one of them has gotten married and that's turned out really bad, and her husband is just a sad sack, awful person. Well, a sad sack wannabe academic who's not actually all that smart or original, and everybody in her family hates him. And then you've got a country doctor in this next cluster who wants to be like the greatest scientific mind of his generation, and he doesn't even know these people in the first cluster at all, and he's just trying to build a practice, and like maybe kind of interested in wooing this girl but not really. Um, and then that girl's brother Fred is, failure to launch guy, and he's in love with his childhood sweetheart, but she doesn't want anything to do with him because he's a sad sack and failure to launch. um, and so there's just this interesting interplay of these clusters of characters who are connected but not necessarily interacting, for much of the book. Um, and it takes a while for you to realize that what they're doing actually does have ultimately a pretty large effect on the other people. And Eliot takes, I mean, this book is 500 pages, give or take a couple, 500 pages long. And it takes probably the first 200 for you to see that these people are all going to actually be interacting with each other, on some scale. And then it probably takes another 100 for them to actually be all interacting on the same exact set of circumstances. And then only in the last 150 pages is everybody working within the same exact set of circumstances, concerned with the same exact outcomes, and it feels like something is actually coming to a head and there's going to be a common ending. But ultimately, there's not even a common ending. Um, so the book takes, again, to sort of go back to this idea of real characters and their interactions. The book takes some genuinely difficult situations, some very real things, very true to life things, and presents them as real life. Not, well, here's this literary device, here's this marriage that this lady's in, and everything's terrible, and her husband's a cad, and then here's her knight in shining armor to come in and save her, and he's perfect. No, right? There are people in this book who get married, have a terrible marriage, realize they've made huge mistakes, um, and then realize, oh, here's this other person who I have, great esteem for. but they're not necessarily in love with them. And that person is not necessarily better than the person they're married to. They're just different. And that person doesn't save them, right? You have not even really love triangles. There are a couple not real love triangles where several characters just aren't interested in each other at all, right? Um, and again, one of the things I think that Eliot is trying to do is sort of present what I think in her day were very common marital stereotypes, right? Um, in our day, I think they're a lot less common, primarily because marriage pretty much only happens now, at least in the West, pretty much only happens now between two people of roughly the same age and socioeconomic status who get married because they're a love match. There are a couple marriages in this book that are not like that at all. Um, or potentially are not like that, right? Or love interests that are not like that, right? You got people who are 15 years apart or more, who are getting married, and often it's not explicitly or not only because they're in love, or maybe not even at all because they're in love. It's just like, oh, well, you'd be a good match. Their social circle says you'd work well together. You 35-year-old man and you 20-year-old woman. And again, I think that was way more common in Eliot's time period. She's not saying those things with the level of discomfort that I think we would see that with in the modern era. I think it's important to read the book in that way to know that when she says, "Oh, here's this young woman, Dorothea Brooke," and at the beginning of this book, she's interested in a man who's uh, 25 years older than she is. And her uncle's kind of like, well, he's kind of lame, but, if you love him, then, like, okay. And she marries him. That, that would be uncommon. Pushing weird. Very, very weird in today's world, right? For a 20-something-year-old woman to marry a 40-something-year-old man, late 40s something year old man, would be really, really weird, I think, in today's world. Um, unless it's a situation like Bill Belichick, where it's just very clear that this young woman is very pleased to have all of his money, and Bill Belichick has enough money that he doesn't really care if there's any actual affection in his relationship. Um, yeah, yeah, but that's not what's depicted in this book. Um, she's in love with this just completely uninspiring, sad sack of a guy. And then, of course, that turns out to be one of the unhappy marriages of the book. Um, this book also depicts falling into debt. And although there is someone who comes along and gets the person, some of these people, out of debt, um, one of the things which is really affecting about the whole sequence of when his character's going into debt is not only are their creditors, really hard on them, but actually his spouse is just not at all helpful. He goes to her and says, "Hey, honey, like we're in debt. Like we're really badly in debt. We could lose our house and all of our furniture." And his wife basically says to him, "Why do you just insist on making me uncomfortable? Like you want me to give up, part of our silver plate that we serve our guests with, and you want me to return my jewelry? Why do you insist on making me uncomfortable? I thought you were going to maintain me in the style that I was used to living in." And then she's like undermining his attempts to get out of debt. He's like, "Hey, I'm going to go talk to this guy about, auctioning off the house." And she's like, "Okay, cool." And then she goes and meets with that guy and is like, "Hey, I know my husband met with you, but like, don't do what he said." She just undermines him at every turn. And their marriage is one that some of these marriages have like they either reach a happy point or there's sort of a good resolution too. Their marriage is just sort of like, yeah, they stayed married, and that's it. It's just like, yep, they didn't get a divorce. which is not what you want to have said about your marriage after 30 years. They didn't get divorced. Cool. Um, yeah. And then there are several people in this book who just realize they've made a complete mess of their lives, and there's no way to fix it, and there's no obvious path forward, and they just sort of have to sit with that. And that's very realistic, I think. There are plenty of people who make a mess and are like, "Oh, I know how to fix this." But there are people in real life and in this book who realize, "Oh, I made a huge mistake." And they'll either try to make amends and it just doesn't work at all. That happens a couple times in this book. Or there's no way for them to fix the problem that is apparent. And they just sort of have to live with a really crappy situation. One of the characters in this book is saddled with that basically the whole book. She gets married and that doesn't work out. And then she's saddled with a really bad set of social and legal consequences for basically the rest of the book. And she's just sort of like, well, sucks to be me. Guess I'll keep getting up and getting out of bed every day. And that's it. She's just sort of forced to live that way and come to terms with it. And I think that, again, is one of the strengths of the book because it is real in that way. It does not ring falsely, which I think a lot of classic literature does. One of my favorite books is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And I think there are a lot of sort of relationships in that book that don't ring true to me. Um, they are very clearly literary in nature. They all fit together and work just so, you know. And there's no loose ends. Middlemarch has loose ends. Middlemarch has weird people who do weird things, and there's not a happy ending for all of them. And there's also not an ironically bad ending for the people you don't like. It's just sort of, yeah, some of these people have a happy ending, some of these people have like kind of a whatever ending. And then there are some people you just never really hear about what happens to them. They're just sort of part of the book, and then the book ends, and you get sort of a postscript, but they're not in it. And yeah, again, that's true to life. There are people, even at my age, there are people who I have known who have been deeply important in my life for some number of years. I'm thinking here of a place like high school, and then those people just sort of fall out of your life, and there's no nice tidy bow to tie on that. There's no postscript that involves them and you and how you all ride off into the sunset corporately or disparately. It's just, yeah, I don't talk to that person anymore. Yeah, like that relationship just sort of ceased to exist. Not because it ended badly, it just kind of ended. And Middlemarch has a lot of those written into it. So, um, so all that to say, and I mentioned this a couple times, those are what I think are the strengths of this book. Really, the only issue that I have with Middlemarch is that it just seems to fail to go anywhere a lot of the time. Um, like I said, the book's a little over 500 pages long in this edition, and it takes the better part of 350 pages for you to realize where things might eventually be going in terms of heading toward a climax to the novel. Um, Part of that I think is actually a result of what I was talking about, that rather than using a bunch of literary tropes, she's actually trying to draw and create real people. And sometimes life doesn't fit those nice literary tropes in terms of rising action, climax, and falling action. That doesn't always happen. I get that, but I think it makes the book a little harder to read because you keep expecting there to be something that's going to happen, and you sort of get a vignette or a scene, and it's like, oh, that's interesting. This marriage isn't working, and they're trying to sort of figure it out, but then they just kind of don't figure it out. They just sort of like hate each other, or not even that. They're just kind of dissatisfied, but they're like, well, we're married, and nobody gets divorced in this time period, so we're married, and that's it. And there's no sense that that's about to change or anything like that. So it meanders. You have that, like I said, that pendulum swing through these different groups of people. And so you'll have a lot of discussion of one cluster of characters, and then the book will just move to another cluster of characters. And you won't know what's happening with this other group of people for a long time, like 70 pages. And then you'll come back to them, and either they're where they you left them, or they've moved forward because something momentous has happened. Um, and so it produces a kind of weird reading experience where there is nothing totally uninteresting in this book, right? If you like reading classics, you will enjoy the experience of reading the various parts of this story. The problem is that you won't know where it's going. You will not have a sense of which of these plot lines is actually going to be one that comes to some sort of fruition. Um, they just sort of go on until very quickly at the end of the book, they end. And I would say of the plot lines, one of them I was like, oh, that's great, good ending. The others that do get sort of a bow tied on the more distinct ending, I was sort of like, okay. So yeah, as I said at the beginning of this, it was fine. It was pleasant, but there is not an outstanding love story that I think makes this book. There's not some sort of social commentary that I think just absolutely knocks it out of the park. Um, there's not some sort of high level of drama that makes this book a must read. It's fine. It's pleasant. If you like classic literature, if you like 17th, 18th, 19th century literature, you'll enjoy this book. Um, maybe I'm missing something. It's entirely possible. I'm a layman, after all. But Middlemarch did not blow my mind. I would not say that it is one of the best books ever written in the English language. It's good. And if you like this sort of literature, I highly recommend it. But it was fine, in my view. Like 3.5 out of 5, probably. Maybe a little, maybe a little bit higher than that, like 3.75 out of 5. But there's no place where you can rate books online where you can do that. So 3.5 is what it gets. Um, yeah. Apropos of literally nothing except that I thought they were really cool, so I wrote them down. This is a pair of quotes from the book. The first one is about that character that I mentioned, Caleb Garth, who I think is probably the only, the only really good, uncomplicatedly good person in the book. And at one point, he's talking about some work that he's just gotten, a job that he's just gotten. And he says, "It's a fine thing to come to a man when he's seen into the nature of business, to have the chance of getting a bit of the country into good fettle, as they say, and putting men into the right way with their farming, and getting a bit of good contriving and solid building done, that those who are living and those who come after will be the better for. I'd sooner have it than a fortune. I hold it the most honorable work that is. It's a great gift of God, Susan." That's his wife. So he's expressing like, hey, I'm just gonna like manage this land, and that's awesome. I think that's why we exist, right? I mean, and I would agree that this is effectively why we exist. God made Adam and Eve farmers, gardeners, landscape architects. Um, so I thought that was a great quote. And then there's um, a description of a man named Bulstrode, who's the singularly dislikable religious character in the book. And it says this about him as part of the narration. Bulstrode was simply a man whose desires had been stronger than his theoretic beliefs, and who had gradually explained the gratification of his desires into satisfactory agreement with those beliefs. Kind of the idea that, yeah, he says that he is a really good person, and he believes himself to be a good person, which means that everything he does, he has to explain in some way how he is still a good person. And in fact, in some cases, how doing that thing, which most people would say, hey, you shouldn't do that. Actually, no. this makes me a good person, not a bad person. We all want to do things. We all justify what we do. And therefore, it's a common desire. You want to think well of yourself? One of the easiest ways to do that is just to come up with a way of how everything you do is actually not bad. So, that's Middlemarch by George Eliot. Again, 3.5 out of 5. Yeah, it was perfectly fine. I enjoyed it. Probably won't be revisiting it anytime soon, but that means that there's a copy sitting idle if you find yourself interested. So, go read something. I'm about to figure out what I'm going to read next, and then I'm going to start reading. See you next time.